When a pile of unwanted beets was offered for free, every rancher in town walked away. But one woman hauled home 12 wagon loads anyway. People laughed, called it a waste of time, and said she'd regret it. Months later, those same ranchers were facing a feed crisis. While others scrambled to keep their cattle fed through the brutal winter, her herd never missed a meal. What did she see in those discarded beets that everyone else missed? And how did one unexpected decision make all the difference? Here's the incredible story. The offer came at the end of a long harvest season, when most ranchers in the county were already thinking about winter. Fields had been cleared, equipment was being serviced, and everyone was calculating how much feed they would need to carry their cattle through the cold months ahead. It was the same routine every year, but this season felt different. Hay prices had been creeping upward, and rumors of a harsh winter were spreading across the region. Even so, nobody expected an opportunity to appear in such an unusual form. Just outside town, a sugar beet processing operation had finished sorting its harvest. Thousands of pounds of culled beets, misshapen, oversized, damaged, or simply unsuitable for processing, had been piled into a massive mound near the edge of the property. The beets weren't spoiled. They simply didn't meet the standards required for production. To the company, they were a problem that needed to disappear. Word spread quickly that anyone willing to haul the beets away could take them for free. At first, the news attracted attention. A few ranchers drove by to inspect the pile. They climbed out of their trucks, kicked a few beets with their boots, and looked over the mountain of discarded produce. Most of them came to the same conclusion within minutes. It wasn't worth the trouble. Loading, transporting, and storing the beets would take time. Fuel wasn't cheap. Labor wasn't cheap. And many believed the beets would rot before they could be used. Some laughed at the idea of spending days hauling what they considered agricultural waste. By the end of the week, interest had almost completely vanished. One afternoon, a rancher named Margaret pulled her truck alongside the pile and stepped out. Unlike the others, she didn't immediately dismiss what she saw. She walked slowly around the mound, studying it from different angles. She picked up a beet, brushed away the dirt, and examined it carefully. Most people saw waste. Margaret saw feed. She knew cattle could eat beets. Years earlier, during a difficult season, her grandfather had supplemented feed with root crops when hay supplies became tight. The memory stayed with her. Looking at the enormous pile before her, she began doing calculations in her head. There had to be enough here to feed cattle for months. The idea sounded almost too simple. If everyone else was ignoring this resource, why not take advantage of it? As she stood beside the towering mound, Margaret made a decision that would soon make her the subject of countless jokes across the county, and eventually change the course of her entire winter. Margaret didn't make her decision lightly. She spent the evening reviewing her feed inventory, checking storage space, and estimating how much time it would take to move the beets from the processing site to her ranch. The numbers weren't perfect, but they were good enough. The beets cost nothing. Her biggest expense would be fuel and labor. Compared to the rising price of hay, it seemed like a gamble worth taking. The next morning, before sunrise, she hitched a wagon to her truck and headed back to the beet pile. Workers at the processing site watched with surprise as she began loading. Few people had shown any real interest in the culled beets, and nobody had returned with serious hauling equipment. Margaret filled her wagon to the brim and carefully secured the load. Dirt-covered beets spilled against the wooden sides as she pulled away and started the slow drive home. By midday, she was back for another load, and then another. People began to notice. In small farming communities, unusual news travels fast. By the second day, ranchers passing the site saw Margaret hauling beets, while everyone else was busy with more traditional preparations for winter. Some stopped to watch. Others shook their heads. "She's wasting her time," one man remarked. "Those things will be rotten before Christmas," another predicted. A few even laughed openly when they saw her return for yet another load. Margaret heard the comments. In a town where everybody knew everybody, avoiding gossip was impossible. But she didn't argue. She simply kept working. Each trip required hours of effort. She loaded the wagon, drove it back to the ranch, unloaded the beets, and organized them for storage. Then she turned around and did it again. The routine was exhausting. Dust coated her clothes. Her muscles ached. By the end of each day, she could barely feel her shoulders. Still, she continued. The growing pile on her property began attracting attention. Neighbors driving past slowed down to stare. Children pointed from car windows. Some people couldn't understand why she was investing so much energy into something everyone else had rejected. One evening, a neighboring rancher stopped by and looked over the expanding mound of beets. "You really think this is going to help?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "I think it'll help more than people realize." The man chuckled and wished her luck before driving away. By the end of the week, Margaret had hauled several wagon loads home. Most ranchers remained convinced she was making a mistake. To them, the beets were little more than a curiosity, an odd project that would eventually fail. But while the jokes continued spreading across the county, Margaret remained focused on a goal only she could see. And she wasn't even halfway finished hauling the pile that everyone else had abandoned. As the days passed, Margaret settled into a relentless routine. Before dawn, she was already on the road, heading toward the processing site with an empty wagon rattling behind her truck. By sunset, she would return home covered in dust and dirt, having spent another long day moving beets that nobody else wanted. Most people assumed she would quit after a few loads. Instead, she kept coming back. The giant pile at the processing plant barely seemed to shrink, but wagon by wagon, Margaret continued hauling it away. Each trip added to the growing stockpile on her ranch. She carefully chose a well-drained area for storage, arranging the beets so air could circulate and moisture wouldn't build up. She knew that if they were stored properly, they could last much longer than many people expected. Still, the criticism never stopped. Whenever she stopped for fuel or supplies, someone would bring up the beets. "How many loads now?" they would ask with a grin. "Too many," another would joke. Some ranchers began placing informal bets on how long it would take before the entire pile spoiled. Others predicted she'd end up hauling the beets right back out as waste before winter was over. Margaret listened politely and went on with her day. She wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. She was trying to prepare for what might lie ahead. Years of ranching had taught her that the biggest mistakes often happened when people assumed the future would look exactly like the past. Weather could change, markets could change, feed supplies could disappear faster than expected. The ranchers who survived difficult years were usually the ones who planned for problems before they arrived. By the middle of autumn, Margaret reached a milestone that surprised even her. 12 wagon loads. When she unloaded the final trip, she stood back and looked over the enormous reserve she had built. What had started as a curious idea was now a serious stockpile. The mound stretched across a large section of the storage area, representing weeks of effort and hundreds of miles of driving. For the first time, even some of her critics admitted she had been committed. Whether she had been smart was another question entirely. As temperatures began to fall, the jokes slowly faded. Harvest season was ending, and everyone shifted their attention toward winter preparations. Hay sheds were filled, equipment was winterized, feed orders were placed. Margaret completed her own preparations with a sense of quiet confidence. She didn't know exactly what the coming months would bring. No one did. But every time she looked at the 12 wagon loads of stored beets, she felt certain of one thing. If winter turned out to be harder than expected, she would be glad she hadn't listened to the people who told her to leave them behind. Winter arrived quietly at first. The early frosts weren't unusual. Thin sheets of ice formed on water troughs during the night, and the fields turned silver each morning before the sun climbed high enough to melt the frost away. Most ranchers welcomed the colder temperatures. It was the normal rhythm of the season, and after years of experience, nobody was particularly concerned. But by late November, the weather began changing. A series of powerful storms swept across the region, bringing freezing temperatures earlier than expected. Snow started accumulating faster than normal, covering grazing areas and making it harder for cattle to find anything edible in the fields. Ranchers, who had hoped to stretch their pasture season, suddenly found themselves relying heavily on stored feed. At first, the situation seemed manageable. Everyone had planned for winter. Everyone had feed. The problem was that winter wasn't behaving like a normal winter. Week after week, the cold refused to ease. More storms arrived. Roads became difficult to travel. Deliveries slowed. Fields disappeared beneath thick blankets of snow. What had started as an ordinary season was becoming something much more serious. Feed consumption increased almost immediately. Cattle burned more energy trying to stay warm in the brutal temperatures, forcing ranchers to use hay supplies faster than expected. Every day, more bales disappeared from storage sheds across the county. Conversations at feed stores began to change. Instead of discussing holiday plans or next year's crops, ranchers talked about inventory. How much hay do you have left? Think it'll last until spring? Have you found any extra suppliers? The answers became increasingly uncertain. Margaret noticed the shift as well. Whenever she visited town, she could sense the growing concern. The same people who had laughed about the Beets a few months earlier were now studying feed prices with worried expressions. Every storm seemed to push costs higher. Every cold snap increased demand. Back at her ranch, she checked her own supplies carefully. The hay reserves were holding steady, and beyond them sat the massive beet stockpile. Snow-covered portions of the mound now, but the reserve remained intact. Looking at it gave her a sense of security she hadn't expected. The countless hours she had spent hauling wagon loads suddenly felt less like a gamble and more like an investment. Meanwhile, many ranchers were beginning to realize that their winter calculations might have been wrong. December wasn't even over, yet some operations were already using feed at a pace normally seen much later in the season. The concern that had once been whispered was becoming impossible to ignore. If the weather continued like this through January and February, feed shortages could become a real possibility. And for the first time since hauling home those discarded beets, Margaret began to suspect that the opportunity everyone had ignored might soon become the most valuable thing on her ranch. January arrived with little mercy. The storms that had worried ranchers in December seemed mild compared to what came next. One Arctic front after another swept across the region, driving temperatures far below normal. Bitter winds cut across open fields, piling snow into deep drifts and making daily chores far more difficult than usual. Every morning became a battle. Ranchers woke before sunrise, bundled themselves against the cold, and fought their way through snow-covered roads to reach their livestock. Water troughs froze faster. Equipment broke more often. Feed had to be delivered through conditions that tested even the most experienced operators. But the greatest challenge wasn't the weather itself. It was the growing realization that feed supplies were disappearing at an alarming rate. The hay that many ranchers expected to last through March was being consumed much faster than planned. Cattle needed extra energy to withstand the relentless cold, and every additional feeding chipped away at reserves that were already under pressure. As word spread across the county, concern turned into urgency. Feed suppliers reported shrinking inventories. Available hay became harder to find. Prices climbed week after week as demand increased. Some ranchers drove long distances searching for additional supplies, only to return home empty-handed. The conversations in town carried a different tone now. Nobody was joking anymore. Instead, ranchers compared numbers, trying to determine how much feed remained and how long it might last. Every storm forecast was studied carefully. Every weather report seemed capable of changing someone's entire outlook for the season. For some operations, difficult decisions became unavoidable. A few ranchers began reducing herd sizes to conserve feed. Others sold cattle earlier than planned, rather than risk running out of hay completely. These weren't choices anyone wanted to make, but survival often required hard decisions. Margaret watched it all unfold with growing concern. She felt sympathy for her neighbors, because she understood exactly how stressful the situation had become. Ranching was difficult enough during normal winters. This winter was testing everyone. Yet her own ranch looked remarkably different. The hay reserves were lower than when winter began, but not dangerously so. More importantly, the enormous beet stockpile remained available whenever additional feed was needed. As conditions worsened, Margaret slowly began incorporating the stored beets into her feeding program. The cattle accepted them readily. Day after day, the reserve that others had mocked started serving its purpose. The effect was immediate. Every feeding that included beets helped preserve valuable hay supplies. Every day the stockpile lasted gave her more flexibility and more security. Meanwhile, the crisis continued deepening across the county. By the time February approached, many ranchers were anxiously counting the remaining weeks until spring. Some weren't sure they had enough feed to get there, and as desperation spread, people began remembering the mountain of discarded beets they had laughed at months earlier, and the one rancher who had seen something valuable when everyone else saw waste. By the first week of February, the feed shortage had become impossible to ignore. Across the county, ranchers were stretching every remaining bale as far as possible. Hay suppliers had little inventory left, and what could still be found came at prices few people wanted to pay. Trucks loaded with feed became a rare sight, and whenever a shipment arrived somewhere, the news spread almost as fast as the winter storms themselves. The season had turned into a test of preparation. Some ranchers were managing, others were barely holding on. Then people began noticing something unusual about Margaret's ranch. While many operations were cutting back and worrying about every feeding, her cattle looked calm and healthy. They weren't crowded around empty feeders. They weren't showing signs of stress. Day after day, her herd continued receiving steady rations despite the worsening conditions. Curiosity quickly replaced the laughter that had surrounded her months earlier. Neighbors driving past slowed down to take a closer look. How was she doing it? What feed source had she found that everyone else had missed? The answer sat in plain sight. The giant beet stockpile. The same mountain of culled beets that had been mocked throughout the fall was now one of the most valuable resources in the county. While other ranchers searched desperately for expensive feed, Margaret was drawing from a reserve she had secured for free months earlier. Each day, she mixed beets into the feeding program, carefully balancing rations and making sure the cattle received what they needed. The stored beets helped reduce pressure on her hay supply, allowing her reserves to last far longer than expected. What had seemed like an odd experiment was proving itself in real time. Before long, ranchers began stopping by the property. At first, they came simply to see the stockpile for themselves. Then they started asking questions. How many wagon loads had she hauled? How well had the beets stored? How much feed had they replaced? Margaret answered honestly. She explained the work involved, the storage methods she used, and the reasons she believed the beets would be valuable long before winter arrived. Many visitors shook their heads in disbelief, not because the plan had failed, because it had worked. One rancher stared at the remaining pile and laughed quietly. I remember saying, "You'd regret hauling those things home." Margaret smiled. So do I. The man looked back at the healthy herd grazing near the feeding area. Looks like I got that one wrong. He wasn't the only one. By mid-February, word of Margaret's success had spread throughout the region. The rancher who had once been the subject of jokes had become an example of smart preparation. And with winter still holding the county in its icy grip, more people were beginning to realize that her greatest advantage wasn't luck. It was the willingness to see opportunity where everyone else saw nothing at all. By late February, winter had reached its harshest point. The snowstorms had finally begun to slow, but the damage to feed supplies across the county was already done. Months of relentless cold had drained inventories that ranchers once believed would carry them comfortably into spring. Every remaining bale of hay seemed precious. Every feeding required careful calculation. For many ranchers, the season had become a daily countdown. They weren't asking whether they had enough feed for the entire winter anymore. They were asking whether they had enough for one more week. The pressure weighed heavily on everyone. Some operations had already sold part of their herds. Others were purchasing expensive emergency feed whenever they could find it. A few were relying on help from neighbors just to make it through the final stretch before warmer weather arrived. Yet on Margaret's ranch, the situation remained remarkably stable. The beet reserve had done exactly what she hoped it would do. Month after month, it had supplemented her feeding program, preserving valuable hay and giving her flexibility when conditions became difficult. While others watched their feed disappear faster than expected, Margaret had another resource to draw from. The difference was visible. Her cattle maintained good condition despite the brutal winter. They continued receiving consistent feed, and there was no sense of panic surrounding daily operations. The ranch still faced challenges like everyone else, but it wasn't facing a crisis. One afternoon, several neighboring ranchers gathered at a local feed store. The conversation quickly turned to winter survival. Everyone shared stories about rising costs, shrinking inventories, and difficult decisions. Eventually, someone mentioned Margaret. "She's probably the only one around here who isn't worried about feed." The group laughed. But this time, the laughter carried admiration instead of doubt. A few months earlier, the mention of Margaret's beets would have sparked jokes. Now it sparked respect. Everyone knew why. She had prepared when preparation seemed unnecessary. She had acted while others hesitated. Most importantly, she had trusted her own judgment when nearly everyone around her disagreed. As the days passed, more ranchers visited her property. Some wanted advice. Others simply wanted to see the famous beet stockpile that had become a local legend. Many admitted the same thing. They had underestimated her. One rancher stood beside the remaining pile and shook his head. "I drove past those free beets 3 different times," he said. "Never once thought they were worth hauling." Margaret smiled. Most people didn't. The man looked across the pasture at the healthy herd. "Guess that's why they're still here." For Margaret, the real reward wasn't proving anyone wrong. It was knowing that a single decision made months earlier had protected her ranch when conditions became toughest. While others fought to find enough feed, she had already secured her answer long before the first snowflake ever fell. As February gave way to March, the grip of winter finally began to loosen. The days grew slightly longer. Temperatures rose a few degrees at a time. Snowbanks that had stood frozen for months slowly started shrinking under the afternoon sun. Across the county, ranchers breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Spring was finally on the horizon. For many, it had been one of the most difficult winters they could remember. Feed shortages, soaring costs, and endless storms had tested every operation. Some ranchers had been forced to make painful decisions. Others had barely managed to hold on until the weather improved. Margaret understood those struggles. She had faced the same storms, the same cold temperatures, and the same uncertainty as everyone else. The difference was that months before winter arrived, she had chosen to act on an opportunity that nobody else believed in. Standing beside the now smaller beet pile, she thought back to the autumn day when she first saw the mountain of discarded beets. At the time, they looked worthless. Most people saw waste. Most people saw extra work. Most people saw a problem. But Margaret had seen potential. That single decision had changed everything. The 12 wagon loads of free beets hadn't magically solved every challenge. They hadn't eliminated hard work or guaranteed success. What they had done was provide a safety net when conditions became difficult. They gave her options when others had few. They bought valuable time when feed supplies across the region were disappearing. And in ranching, sometimes having options is the difference between struggling and surviving. Before long, the story of the beet stockpile spread beyond the county. People shared it not because of the beets themselves, but because of the lesson behind them. Opportunities don't always arrive in shiny packages. Sometimes they look like extra work. Sometimes they look like risk. And sometimes They look exactly like the things everyone else is walking away from. The ranchers who remembered Margaret's story understood something important. Success often belongs to the people willing to think differently, to prepare early, and to recognize value where others see none. As spring finally arrived and green began returning to the fields, Margaret's herd emerged from winter healthy and well-fed. The jokes were long gone. In their place was a quiet respect earned through foresight, determination, and a willingness to trust her instincts. The mountain of free beets that everyone ignored had become one of the smartest investments she ever made. And it all started with a simple choice: to look twice at something the rest of the world had already dismissed. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring story of resilience, smart thinking, and rural life. And tell us in the comments, would you have hauled home those 12 wagon loads of free beets, or would you have passed them by like everyone else? We'd love to hear your answer. Until next time, thanks for watching.